Hello, America and the world. This is Radio Free Market, and I am your host, Michael McKay. We are behind the lines of socialism, my friends, and Radio Free Market is the voice of free people and free markets. Our topic today, the 6 illusions of government, with Dr. Jim Payne. Welcome, Jim.
How are you, Michael?
Excellent. How are you doing tonight?
Good. I guess we're both where we got winter storms here.
Oh, yes, you're up in Idaho.
Yes.
Yes. Okay, so folks, Dr. Payne is a retired professor of political science who has taught at Yale, Johns Hopkins, and Texas A&M University. He is also the author of 6 Political Illusions, which was the inspiration for this interview. By the way, I highly recommend this book as a basic primer about government. We also have with us today our special commentator, Mr. Aaron Brown. Welcome, Aaron.
Glad to be here, Michael.
Yeah, glad to have you back. So, folks, Aaron is a graduate of Mises University 2010 and is currently finishing his bachelor's degree in marketing from the University of San Diego Business School. Aaron also is primarily responsible for making this show happen. He accepted the role of organizing the content and the logistics of this show. Okay, so let's get started with the first illusion, the philanthropic illusion. Aaron, go ahead.
All right. So this is, I thought this was probably the most important because it's so prevalent in everyone's mind, and that the philanthropic illusion is the illusion that, what in your mind is a philanthropic illusion?
It's the idea that government has money. In a way, you can call these illusions the socialist illusions, because if you take all of them together, you wind up being a pretty much dyed-in-the-wool socialist. And the early socialists of 50, 75, 100 years ago were just thoroughly swayed by all of these illusions. Right. The first one is the philanthropic illusion, is the idea that government is wealthy, so that if you have...
Well, let me ask you something. I'm going to jump in here and ask you this question, Jim. What do you mean that government has no money? I mean, that's where you're
government going with has money.
You know, but of course it has money. How else would it do all the things it does, like fund the military? You know, that's expensive.
Right.
It's obvious that people in government couldn't do that without money.
Right, right. But that it would... But the question is, where does it get it? And it is not an independent source of wealth, which is what the philanthropic illusion presupposes. It has to
Where does the government get its money?
Well, it takes it away from everybody and takes it away from good causes and needy people and everything that we say we want to help. That's the irony of it, is that the very system whereby we think we're helping all these things, art museums, education, and so forth, that help is achieved by draining funds from all of those good causes, art museums, education, and so forth.
Yeah, you make the point that in your book, which again I want to recommend everybody purchase and read your book. I thought it was an excellent, excellent book, that the government actually gets its money primarily through taxes and borrowing and through counterfeiting.
Right. Well, and those other two, presumably the borrowing and the inflation or the expansion of the money supply, yes, they have their own penalties and so forth. And I think it's healthier to put those to one side and just think in terms of the taxes, and especially the indirect or shifted effects of taxes, which people don't realize. The first reaction that most people give when you say, like, the poor are suffering from taxation is that, well, they don't pay income tax. But people don't stop and think that we have dozens of taxes going on around here, and plus there are the shifted...
Well, Jim, you know, I'm sorry I'm going to have to interrupt you, but we're coming to the end of our first break. And when we come back, folks, we'll be repeating or continuing with our interview with Dr. Jim Payne on the 6 illusions of government. Please stay with us. Welcome back, everyone. This is Radio Free Market, and I'm your host, Michael McKay, and with me, Dr. Jim Payne, and we're talking about the 6 illusions of government, which Jim just said are actually should be called the 6 socialist illusions of government. And Aaron, you wanted to bring out another point or expand on a point Dr. Payne had just begun. Please go ahead.
Yeah, so right before the break, Dr. Payne, you talked about the shifting effect of taxes. And there's an economist, and one of the things I really liked about the book is that you're obviously a student of economics. And Henry Hazlitt said that the most important lesson is to look at the short run and the long run of policies, and not how they just affect one group, but how they affect all groups. And so you gave the example that, the burden of taxes, they're borne indirectly, and I think that's really relevant today because there's so much talk of taxing the wealthy. There's actually a book, I don't know if you've seen it, it's called Are the Rich Necessary? So I just wanted you to explain, how does taxing, let's say, a wealthy corporation affect everyone indirectly, not just that corporation?
Well, you can't actually. The corporation is just a piece of paper. You can only tax human beings in one form or another. And in the case of corporation, it's the consumers of the product will have to pay a higher price. The workers in the corporation will get less wages, and the stockholders and investors in the corporation will get a smaller return. Those are the 3 categories of human beings that pay the corporation tax. The corporation doesn't pay anything. I mean, it's just a piece of paper.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, so on the next... What's up?
Yeah, go ahead, Aaron.
Okay. I really can't say enough about this book. It's just a great book. You wrote that, there's kind of this illusion, again, this philanthropic illusion, that politicians who endorse, more spending on social programs are benevolent, and if they oppose things like, Social Security and Medicare, they're heartless. Could you speak to this fallacy, specifically from the moral view? How could overcoming the philanthropic illusion change a person's view on this issue?
Well, the corrective that I suggest people practice is you can't just say government should spend money on X. That kind of statement is a kind of a half-truth, or it involves the philanthropic illusion. So you should say and start listing the good causes that you think should be harmed. Like, for instance, we should take money away from education and give it to green energy. A statement like that. Or we should take money away from struggling single mothers and give it to farmers.
So when you've overcome the philanthropic illusion, you just see all these programs, they are really, what they are is just forced and arbitrary redistribution.
Yeah, or not even cycling money around. Right. I mean, the theory is they're redistributing it from wealthy to poor, but it's not even clear that that's happening. And one sign of and this is the philanthropic illusion at work here, is that the liberals and the socialists do not make careful, extensive studies of taxation and the impact of taxation to find out and make sure that the people they think they're helping are actually being helped by the whole tax and spend system. They just sort of blindly assume that government is taking money away from rich people or people that don't deserve it or people that shouldn't have it and so forth. And that's got to be validated. That's got to be measured and calculated, and it's not done.
Now, Aaron, you had, when we were talking about in the preparation of this show, you wanted to bring out a point about good King Wenceslas, I think is what he's referred to. You want to bring out that point now?
Yeah, so you gave the story of King Wenceslas. He gave food to an impoverished peasant, and the story portrayed it as just this wonderful act, gracious act. But on the surface, it seems like a nice thing to do. But could you tell our listeners how the philanthropic illusion really conceals the true nature of this situation? And I kind of wanted you to hint at, why is the peasant poor in the first place? It just kind of begs the question.
Sure. No, and the idea that this song is so unequivocally sort of popular and accepted and not questioned shows the power of this illusion, that the king is some kind of philanthropist, that he earned his money and so forth and then gave some of it to help somebody else. But a king gets his money through taxes. He sends his soldiers around to the farms and seizes chickens and pigs and stuff, and they take them back. So this poor peasant was undoubtedly taxed, probably directly and certainly through the indirect effect of taxation, and that's why the peasant was starving.
That's exactly right. And we were just talking about government putting money in circulation, how this is somehow supposed to help the economy, and you did such a great job on this section. I just want to let you go at it. Could you just give us a brief insight into the fallaciousness of the arguments that are made in support of government spending programs as, quote, putting money in circulation or creating jobs?
Yes, well, that again assumes that government is a source of wealth. As soon as you stop and say, well, any money that government has, had to take away from some function and activity. And if you can think of it as there was an investor about to start a factory that would employ thousands of people, and you taxed his money away. So those people didn't get hired and so forth. Maybe you hired some people with that tax money, probably much fewer. We have to get to the frictionless state issue, because thus far, if you break through the philanthropic illusion, you finally realize, well, at best, government is cycling money around. It's taking money away from farmers, giving it to homeowners, taking it away from homeowners, giving it to farmers, and so forth. And so it's not doing that much good. To understand the full harm of it, you have to go to this other illusion, the illusion of the frictionless state, which is that these transfers that the government makes essentially have no cost or waste embedded in them, so that maybe they don't do too much good, but they're not doing much harm. And
well, before we go too far into that, I want to come back. I want to jump back a little bit and address something that you wanted to put aside for a minute, and that's fine. And that was, I wanted you to explain, if you would, the inflation tax.
Well, say if government does not take the dollars it's spending from people and let us to visualize it, simply prints them, then it is expanding the money supply. And right, it's not getting those dollars through taxation, it's getting them through the printing press or other means of expanding the money supply. But when you put this more money in circulation, then you've got more dollars chasing the same amount of goods, and you have an inflation. So that, it's a tax, and it's spread over everybody, maybe even homeless people, everyone who uses the currency. And it's a tax that is never computed and calculated and weighed in your tax bill, but it's there.
That's certainly a relevant issue today. So we're going to move on to that first chapter is really important, so we wanted to spend a lot of time on it. But the second chapter was on the voluntary illusion. So what is the voluntary illusion? Just in 22 sentences.
The quickest way to decide whether a person is under the influence of it is just to ask, is government based on force? And you'll get two kinds of answers. It's a very interesting test here. One test, the person will say, obviously, of course, absolutely. And those people are not subject to the voluntary illusion. They understand this. Well, there is probably a majority of people not clear on this subject. They don't like to think of government as being based on physical force. I mean, if they stop and think about it, what are all these policemen with their guns and the prisons with their locks and so forth? That's physical force. But since, especially in modern days, we find force is a kind of unpleasant and unpopular tactic, people don't like to recognize that everything that government does is based on this threat of force, threat of using violence against person and property if you don't comply with what government does. And I say most...
So let me jump in here, Jim, and ask you this question. If this is so, why do the IRS publications, for one example, say that the tax system is voluntary?
Well, it's the voluntary illusion. They are embarrassed, like I say, politicians are embarrassed, liberals in general are embarrassed, to say government is based on force. And that, yes, we're taking this money away from you, by our threat of putting you in jail. So that's the voluntary illusion at work in the actually hundreds of places where the IRS and the Supreme Court has also gone along with this kind of language from time to time, wants to say that it is not based on distraint. It's a voluntary system. And then, of course, people say, well, if it's voluntary, I'd rather not be part of it. And they find they're in court and going to jail. And, oh, yeah, it's a perfect example of this Kafkaesque abuse of language.
You know, we're not going to be able to finish this question and answer, so I'm just going to get it started, and we'll get it going after the next break. But you wrote, and I think is the most important point to take away from this chapter on the voluntary illusion, that the question of government violence doesn't apply to individuals who follow the government's commands because they feel the commands are sensible. They respect authority, they feel proud of their country, et cetera, et cetera. But this point is critical in regard to those who don't do what government wants. You know, and what I'm going to want to have you do is, when we get back from the break, expand on this particular point, on comment on the importance of just how vitally important this point is, that it's for those who don't want to do what the government wants that this is really being focused on.
Sure.
And so that's going to be an important point for us to come back into when we get back in just a minute. So, folks, please stay with us. This is Radio Free Market, and I'm your host, Michael McKay, and with me, Dr. Jim Payne. We've been talking about the 6 illusions of government, and we'll be right back in just a minute. And welcome back, everyone. This is Radio Free Market, and just before the break, we were talking with Dr. Jim Payne on the voluntary illusion, and Aaron, you wanted to bring out a little bit more on that question before Dr. Payne answered. Please go ahead.
Yeah, so I just want to restate the question really briefly in case you missed it. So I thought this was really the most important point about the chapter on the voluntary illusion, that government's basis in physical force, it's not really important for people who obey the government, but when you don't want to obey the government, this is when this point becomes really important. So could you just comment on that?
Well, it's every system of deterrence functions by most people going along with something and not thinking about it, and only the marginal, the 1 out of 100 person says, well, maybe I don't like this idea, and you use force against him to keep the whole system going. To give you a quick example of this kind of thing, in India they used to have, in ancient times, until the British eliminated, the custom of sati, where the wife of a man who dies puts herself up on the funeral pyre and burns herself alive with him. It turned out that most of these women, in fact virtually all of them, were doing this quote-unquote voluntarily. That is, they wanted to do it. But if you ask, what kept that horrible system going, the answer is every so often there would be a woman, 1 out of 100, who said, I'd rather not. And they took her and pushed her up there and made her burn. And that's what kept the whole custom going. And that's what we've got in the case of these force-based practices like taxation.
Mm-hmm. So why do people have the tendency to overlook the government's basis in physical force, especially, when we look at things that like Social Security, Medicare, food stamps, or public education?
Well, because the orientation for about the last 100 years of public policy in government is that government is supposed to be the nice, the compassionate instrument to make a nicer society. And so if you stop and say, well, how is it making this nice society? And the answer is it's using the very deplorable means of force and the threat of force. It becomes contradictory. And therefore, people, they're either going to have to flip on their political positions and say, well, maybe, something like Social Security or medical help based on force isn't very kind and nice, or they're going to sweep under the rug, which is what we've done, or the public generally does, sweep it under the rug that this thing is based on force.
Mm-hmm. That's I think an extremely astute observation. So, Aaron, you had another question about a book?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and this is a book I'm planning on reading it. Haven't read it yet, and I've heard of it before. It's a book that you mentioned by Edward Bellamy. In 1888, he wrote a book called Looking Backwards.
Right.
And it's a really interesting and prescient book. Can you just tell us briefly about what the plot is?
Well, yes, the plot is a young man falls asleep. This is in Boston, and I forget exactly what happened. Some kind of fire happened in his house or something, and it somehow drugged him for over 100 years, and he wakes up in the year 2000. And this is, so that's 120 years ahead of when this was written. And basically what's happened there is that you have the perfect socialist state with government wisely owning, controlling, and directing everything. All industries. It's giving everybody a stipend of exactly the same amount and so forth. It owns all property. Nobody is allowed to have any money. They go to this thing called a store and they get their stipend in credits there for the things they want to buy. And it's portrayed as a utopia. And what's significant about it is that this is a kind of classic example of someone who was just totally overcome by these 6 political illusions that I'm writing about. And this is in a day and age when government hadn't started to try to do this stuff. So a person could be, maybe somewhat excused that in believing that government would be wealthy, government would be all wise and so forth. And that one of the other ones in there is that it's completely voluntary, he says. Although, as I point out, if you read closely, you'll find a spot where he flatly contradicts that and does not realize that he's doing that. And he talks about putting people in prison and don't do what they want them to.
Right. It does seem that the United States is headed in that particular direction, and unfortunately, I always like to bring out this point. We brought it out in a number of our shows on what we call encroaching socialism, and as being something that was a technique that was used by Lenin, that was used by Hitler, that was used in the Czech Republic. It's been used throughout the world. In one of our recent shows that we just did with Dr. Yuri Maltsev, he went on rather at length about that particular point. And what we really need to see is an encroaching freedom, encroaching liberty. But, it's an interesting idea that Dr. Maltsev brought out that back when the Soviet Union collapsed, there was all these plans that were mentioned for a 100-day plan and to convert to liberty, and he came out with a one-day plan. He said, rather than what good would it do if we changed everybody from driving on the right lane to the left lane in over time? We have to do it in one day or it creates a mess. And I see we're coming to the end of our segment, so we'll pick up this point as soon as we get back. So
yes,
folks, please stay with us.
Please.
This is Radio Free Market, and we'll be back right after the break.